Chapter 1. The Burden of Dust. The rain in the outskirts of the capital, Chang'an, wasn't a gentle weeping. It was a relentless hammering assault, a gray, oily deluge that seemed to cling to everything: the slick cobblestones, the mud-caked carts, and the perpetually hunched figure of Yan-Zhu. He shifted the weight of the ox cart, its enormous wooden wheels groaning a mournful song against the stone, each heave a small, insistent rebellion against the fatigue that gnawed at his bones. He was, to all appearances, a peasant. A particularly unremarkable one, at that. His face, weathered and etched with the marks of hardship, was perpetually shadowed beneath a worn straw hat. His clothes a patched and faded tunic of coarse hemp, trousers caked in manure blended seamlessly with the grimy reality of his life. Even his movements, deliberate and slow, seemed to mimic the lumbering pace of the oxen he guided. This was, after all, the carefully constructed illusion Head cultivated for the past 5 years. He wasn't born to this life. Not entirely. He was the sole heir to Yan Prefecture, a territory that pulsed with the very lifeblood of the empire, the grain. Its fertile fields, blessed by the rivers that snaked through the mountains, fed Chang'an, the imperial capital, and beyond. The imperial granaries, filled to bursting with rice and wheat, resided within Yan's borders. But the emperor, fearful of a rebellious grandson wielding such power, had exiled Yan-Zhu, then a spirited, eager youth, forcing him into this backwater existence, a punishment disguised as a safeguard. Head learned quickly that appearances were everything. The mountain core technique, inherited from his ancestors, was a carefully guarded secret, a roaring inferno contained within a disciplined shell. It was the weight of mountains, literally. The ability to manipulate his own density, to become impossibly dense, to stop an arrow mid-flight, to deliver a blow that could shatter stone. It was a gift, a burden, and the key to his eventual revenge. He practiced it sparingly, only when the mocking, bruising reminders of his isolation became unbearable. Today, the mocking was particularly sharp. Commander Deng and his officers, a swaggering collection of men adorned with gleaming armor and arrogant smiles, were stationed just beyond the outskirts of the mud track where Yan-Zhu worked. They were, as always, a brutal reminder of his degraded state. "Look at him," Deng bellowed, his voice laced with condescending amusement. He gestured with a gloved hand towards Yan-Zhu, who was struggling to maneuver the cart uphill. "A veritable brute. Doesn't even know how to manage a simple beast." The other officers erupted in laughter, their voices echoing off the rain-slicked walls of the surrounding buildings. One, a particularly cruel man named Li, spat on the ground near Yan-Zhu's cart. "He'd be better off pulling a plow than driving a cart." Yan-Zhu didn't respond. He simply tightened his grip on the ox whip, his knuckles white, and continued his work. He had learned to be a master of patience, a sculptor of silence. Deng, emboldened by the amusement of his men, stepped forward. "Let's see your strength, peasant," he challenged, drawing his saber with a flourish. "Ilwager, my stallion, could drag you through the mud with ease." He signaled to his horse, a magnificent warhorse named Thunder, and the beast began to trot towards Yan-Zhu. The reins tugged taut. Deng whipped Thunder with brutal force, intending to use Yan-Zhu as a living anchor, a test of the horse's brute strength. Yan-Zhu braced himself, his muscles coiling, his breath held. He allowed Thunder to drag him, the icy rain stinging his skin, the leather of the rope biting into his hands. He felt the strain, the jarring impact against the earth, but he didn't resist. He simply endured, a statue of quiet determination. As Thunder pulled, Yan-Zhu focused, visualizing the dense weight of a granite boulder, feeling the pressure build within him. The air around him shimmered subtly, a barely perceptible distortion of the gray rain. Just as Deng was preparing to unleash another vicious lash, Yan-Zhu abruptly stopped. The rope went slack, Thunder stumbled, and Deng stared in stunned disbelief. "What was that?" he stammered, regaining his composure. Yan-Zhu remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Deng, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "The earth provides," he said, his voice low and deliberately neutral, "but sometimes it needs to be reminded of its power." Before Deng could react, a young woman, Xiao Hui, emerged from a small tea stall set up nearby, her face etched with concern. She was a splash of warmth in the desolate landscape, a small beacon of kindness. She offered Yan-Zhu a steaming cup of tea, her eyes holding a genuine empathy that defied the commander's arrogance. She saw, perhaps, the weariness beneath the carefully constructed fade, and it mirrored something within her own quiet spirit. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Mountain Core. The rain had ceased, leaving a slick gray sheen across the capital's cobblestone streets. The air, thick with the scent of manure and damp stone, clung to Yan-Zhu's threadbare tunic. He was hauling his cart, a rickety thing, salvaged from a forgotten corner of the Imperial warehouses towards the Grand Imperial granary. His usual, miserable task. Deng's officers, a collection of flushed, self-important men, eyed him with a mixture of disdain and morbid curiosity. The incident with the boar, while spectacular, had left a lingering unease in their ranks, a realization that their carefully constructed hierarchy was built on a foundation of ignorance. Deng, still visibly shaken, approached him with a cautious gait. "Yan-Zhu," he said, his voice subdued. I still find it difficult to comprehend what you did. A simple ox driver, defying a beast of that size. It defied all logic." Yan-Zhu didn't respond immediately. He carefully maneuvered the cart around a puddle, the rhythmic strain of the wheels, a comforting counterpoint to the awkwardness of the exchange. "Logic is a fragile thing, Commander," he finally said, his voice measured. "It breaks easily under the weight of the unexpected." Deng bristled, a flicker of his former arrogance returning. "Don't patronise me, peasant. You demonstrated a peculiar ability, a dangerous one at that. The Emperor will undoubtedly be interested." He gestured towards a small detachment of Imperial guards, their armor gleaming dully in the overcast light. "I've requested their presence to observe your talents." Yan-Zhu simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant, towering walls of the granary. He knew what was coming. These guards wouldn't be there out of respect or curiosity. They were there to assess the threat, to quantify the power he wielded, to bring him under control. He wouldn't be a tool for the Emperor. Not yet. As the guards began their examination, meticulously measuring the area where had shattered the boar, Xiao Hui appeared, her small tea stall drawn up beside the cart. She offered Yan-Zhu a warm bowl of spiced pork noodles, the steam rising in fragrant tendrils. "You worked hard today," she said, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the officer's gruffness. "A little nourishment will do you good." The guards, unused to displays of kindness, regarded her with suspicion. Captain Li, the most senior of the detachment, a man with a face like weathered granite, barked. "What business do you have here, girl?" "You're interfering with Imperial business." Yan-Zhu, without a word, took a mouthful of the noodles, the warmth spreading through him. The simple act of eating, of acknowledging Xiao Hui's offer, was a small rebellion, a quiet assertion of his autonomy. "She's been kind to me," he said, his voice firm, surprising even himself, "and kindness should not be considered interference." He glanced at Deng, who flushed with anger. "Furthermore," he continued, turning his attention to the guards, "I assure you, my abilities are not a threat. They are merely a reflection of the Earth's inherent strength." During the next hour, as the guards conducted their clumsy, inefficient assessment, measuring the crater's dimensions, analyzing the residue of the shattered stone, Yan-Zhu demonstrated his control, albeit subtly. He requested a small, loose rock, and with a concentrated effort, he increased its density, causing it to momentarily resist a guard's probing hand. The guards, startled, attributed it to a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in their observation. It was during this exercise that Xiao Hui noticed something profound. As Yan-Zhu focused his energy, the surrounding air shimmered again. But this time, it wasn't the subtle distortion of the rain. It was a deeper, more resonant ripple, like the echoing song of a hidden mountain spring. She recognized it instantly. The telltale sign of the mountain core state. She didn't speak, but she quietly placed a small, perfectly formed jade pebble, a gift from her family, into his hand. It was an offering of respect, a silent acknowledgement of the power he contained. As he examined the pebble, a flicker of awareness crossed his face, a momentary glimpse of the immense reservoir of energy within him. He looked at Xiao Hui, a fleeting expression of gratitude, and something akin to understanding. The guards, oblivious to this exchange, continued their scrutiny. Suddenly, Captain Li, attempting to provoke a response, deliberately stepped onto a loose stone, testing its stability. Yan-Zhu's hand shot out, not with force, but with a gentle pressure. The stone didn't crumble, but it did shift subtly, sending a ripple through the ground. This time, the guards reacted. They drew their swords, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a nascent fear. "Zaitse him!" Captain Li roared, but before they could move, Yan-Zhu simply vanished. Not disappeared entirely, but dissolved into the surrounding landscape, becoming one with the earth. The effect was brief, almost imperceptible. A subtle blurring of his form as he retreated into the shadows of the granary walls. He reappeared a moment later, standing calmly beside his cart, the jade pebble still clutched in his hand. Deng stared, speechless, the guards frozen in disbelief. Yan-Zhu offered a small, almost melancholic smile. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying a weight far beyond his humble appearance, "the earth simply chooses to hide." Chapter 3: Echoes of the Stone. The air in the capital hung thick with bewildered murmurs. Commander Deng, stripped of his dignity, and a prisoner of Yan-Zhu's quiet power, was a shadow of his former arrogance. His attempts to regain face were pathetic, sputtering accusations of witchcraft and divine intervention, met only with the impassive silence of the Imperial Guard. The incident with the obsidian boar, and the subsequent unsettling demonstration of Yan-Zhu's capabilities, had become the talk of the court. Whispers circulated that he was a demon, a spirit bound to the earth, a relic of a forgotten age. Yan-Zhu, meanwhile, continued his life as the ox driver, a deliberate act of obfuscation. He diligently hauled his stones, the rhythmic exertion a counterpoint to the swirling chaos surrounding him. He deliberately avoided attention, meeting the wary glances of officials with a courteous nod and a downcast expression. Yet, beneath that veneer of humble servitude, a subtle shift had begun. The jade pebble, now worn smooth from his constant handling, seemed to thrum with a barely perceptible energy, a silent resonance with the power he controlled. Xiao Hui, initially terrified, found herself increasingly drawn to him. She began to visit the tea stall more frequently, not just to offer her meticulously prepared drinks and buns, but to simply observe. She watched as he handled the oxen with a remarkable gentleness, his movements precise and economical, imbued with a strange, contained strength. She noticed the way he seemed to listen to the land, his head tilted slightly, his eyes scanning the ground as if perceiving something unseen. It was during one of these visits that the true extent of his control began to manifest again, this time with a far more dramatic effect. A young Imperial scholar, Master Lin, a man notorious for his abrasive intellect and penchant for provoking, decided to test Yan-Zhu's patience. Master Lin, recently appointed to oversee the assessment of local grain yields, was convinced Yan-Zhu's unusually large harvest was the result of illicit manipulation, a dangerous accusation, against a high-ranking official. "You drive oxen, peasant," Master Lin sneered, gesturing towards the cart with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But you control the very earth beneath our feet. Tell me, how do you guarantee such abundance?" Yan-Zhu simply continued his work, efficiently loading the cart, his movements unhurried, utterly unfazed by the scholar's insolence. Master Lin, infuriated, deliberately stepped onto a meticulously placed paving stone, expertly positioned to create a slight imbalance. He chuckled, a grating sound, as the stone visibly shifted, threatening to buckle under his weight. This time, Yan-Zhu didn't vanish. He didn't even flinch. But his hand, moving with a speed that defied human perception, reached out. Not with a strike, but with a delicate, focused pressure. It was as if he was applying an infinitesimal amount of force, a whisper against the stone. The stone didn't crumble. It didn't even tremble. Instead, a wave of silence seemed to emanate from Yan-Zhu, a subtle disruption in the air itself. The paving stone, instead of succumbing to Master Lin's pressure, reversed. It lifted, hovering momentarily in mid-air, before settling back into place with a precise, controlled movement. Master Lin gasped, stumbling backward, his face drained of color. He stared at Yan-Zhu, his bravado utterly shattered. A nearby guard, a veteran named Zhao, recognized the impossible. He drew his sword, but not to attack. He drew it defensively, his eyes wide with a primal understanding of the danger he now faced. The weight of mountains, Zhao whispered, the words of fragmented memory from a forgotten martial arts scroll. It's true, suddenly. A tremor ran through the ground, more pronounced this time. The air shimmered, and a network of intricate patterns almost like the roots of a colossal tree, briefly appeared in the dust around Yan-Zhu's cart. These patterns, visible only for a heartbeat, depicted the flow of energy within the earth, mapping the density fluctuations that allowed him to manipulate his own weight. The Imperial scholars, the court officials, even the Emperor's advisors, witnessed this phenomenon. Their initial skepticism dissolved into terrified awe. The truth, long dismissed as legend, was undeniable. Yan-Zhu was not merely a peasant, he was a weapon of terrifying power, a living embodiment of the Earth's defense. As the shimmering patterns faded, Yan-Zhu turned his gaze towards Master Lin, his expression devoid of emotion. "The Earth is patient, Master Lin," he said, his voice resonating with an almost unnerving calm. "But it remembers those who disrespect its balance." Before anyone could react, before anyone could even formulate a plan, Yan-Zhu simply closed his eyes, took a slow, deliberate breath, and lifted the entire cart, laden with stone, effortlessly into the air. He suspended it, several feet above the ground, seemingly held aloft by nothing. The silence that followed was broken only by the stifled gasps and frantic prayers of the assembled court. The weight of mountains had not only been revealed, it was actively demonstrated, a chilling testament to the power of the man who called himself merely a peasant. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Core. The cart hung suspended, a stark white anomaly against the gray stone of the Imperial courtyard. The air thickened with a palpable tension, a magnetic pull of disbelief and burgeoning fear. Master Lin, a wizened scholar known for his meticulous records of ancient martial arts, remained impassive, his eyes fixed on Yan-Zhu with an expression that bordered on reverence. He was the one who had recognized the subtle signs, the unnatural stillness of Yan-Zhu's movements, the way the dust seemed to cling to him with an unusual density, the faint tremors that rippled through the ground whenever he exerted himself. "The technique, it's not simply density manipulation," Master Lin finally rasped, his voice barely audible above the murmuring crowd. "It's an amplification, a conduit. His channeling the energy of the earth itself, drawing upon the very essence of the mountains." The High Minister, Lord Zhao, a man whose ambition had built his fortune on exploiting the Yan Prefecture's grain reserves, stepped forward, his face a mask of carefully constructed composure. "This is unprecedented," he declared, his voice strained. "The legends spoke of the weight of mountains, but to see it manifested so blatantly, it is a dangerous precedent. We must understand the extent of this power." Yan-Zhu remained motionless, the cart still suspended. He wasn't showing off, wasn't reveling in the spectacle. His demeanor was one of calculated observation, as if cataloging the reactions of those who had suddenly glimpsed the horrifying reality of his potential. It was Xiao Hui, however, who broke the rigid formality. She didn't approach with fear or awe, but with a quiet, unnerving calm. "You are the earth," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and the earth remembers." The words, simple as they were, struck a chord. It was the same sentiment that Xiao Hui had expressed to him before, the one that had resonated so deeply within his soul. Suddenly, the court realized the truth of her intuition. She hadn't just seen strength in Yan-Zhu's hands, she had seen the soul of the earth itself. Without a word, Yan-Zhu began to lower the cart. As it descended, the shimmering patterns, the echoes of the mountain core state briefly reappeared in the dust around him, now more pronounced, tracing intricate paths that snaked across the courtyard floor. These weren't static depictions, they pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, almost as if reacting to his movements. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the shimmering ceased. Yan-Zhu's hand, now empty, clenched into a fist. He didn't speak, but his eyes, normally a dull gray, burned with an intense, almost molten gold. It was a subtle shift, barely perceptible, but it sent a wave of icy terror through the assembled ranks. "The earth does not tolerate disrespect lightly," he said, his voice now a low rumble, laced with the sound of shifting stone. "Commander Deng's arrogance and cruelty have sown seeds of imbalance. These seeds will be harvested." A collective gasp swept through the courtyard. The Imperial Guard, normally a formidable force, shifted uneasily, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Lord Zhao, sensing an opportunity, attempted to regain control. "Silence. This is an act of blatant aggression. We must act swiftly to maintain order." But Yan-Zhu ignored him. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, lingering on Deng, who was huddled in a corner, pale and trembling. Then, with a single, fluid motion, he raised his hand. It wasn't a gesture of aggression, not initially. It was a gesture of focused intent. The air around Deng crackled with energy. A low, subsonic hum filled the courtyard, growing in intensity until it vibrated through every bone in their bodies. Suddenly, Deng's feet lost purchase on the stone. He began to sink, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, disappearing completely into the ground. The earth beneath him didn't simply swallow him, it reformed itself, creating a perfectly circular pit, 15 feet deep, lined with newly formed polished granite. Silence descended again, heavier now, imbued with the profound implications of what had just transpired. Even the Emperor, who had remained a silent, watchful figure on his throne, visibly paled. Yan-Zhu stepped to the edge of the pit, examining it with a detached curiosity. "The earth provides," he said, his voice devoid of pity, "but it also demands a reckoning." He then turned his attention to Master Lin. "The patterns you observed," he said, "they are not merely a display of power. They are a warning. The earth remembers those who violate its sanctity, and it will respond with overwhelming force." He paused, his golden eyes burning into the scholar. "Your record of the ancient martial arts is incomplete, Master Lin. You focused on technique. I remind you, knowledge of power is nothing without respect for the source." With a final, dismissive glance at the stunned court, Yan-Zhu simply turned and walked away, his movements as silent and deliberate as the rising of a mountain. Xiao Hui remained, staring down into the pit, a single thoughtful frown creasing her brow. The echoes of the mountain core state lingered in the air, a potent reminder of the power that now resided in the hands of the peasant who had once hauled manure. Chapter 5. The Stone's Verdict, the aftermath of Yan-Zhu's demonstration, settled over the Imperial court like a thick, gray fog. The initial shock had given way to a brittle, uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the nervous shuffling of officials and the occasional, hushed whisper. The High Minister, Lord Zhao, a man whose silver hair and carefully cultivated air of authority had previously dominated the assembly, now resembled a cornered rat, darting glances at the Emperor, the Grand Scholar, and, of course, Yan-Zhu, who was currently observing the meticulous cleaning of the newly formed pit with an almost unsettling calm. Master Lin, his face ashen and his hands trembling, remained rooted to the spot, clutching his scrolls of meticulously recorded martial arts diagrams. He had for decades been considered the foremost scholar on the subject of the weight of mountains, a repository of knowledge that had been largely dismissed as esoteric, and, frankly, a fanciful tale. Now his expertise was not just acknowledged, but fundamentally challenged. The Emperor, a man known for his pragmatism and ruthless efficiency, was the first to break the silence. "Interesting," he declared, his voice carrying a strange, measured weight. "Very interesting indeed. Master Lin, perhaps you could elaborate on the phenomenon? What exactly is the mountain core state, and what is its purpose?" Yan-Zhu answered, not with a detailed explanation of the complex bioenergetic manipulation that governed his ability, but with a simple, chilling observation. "The Earth chooses its champions. It rewards those who understand its language, and it punishes those who seek to exploit it." He gestured to the pit with a subtle flick of his wrist. "This is a demonstration of that choice." Lord Zhao, recovering some of his composure, interjected, "But your Imperial Majesty, this display of power is destabilizing. The military relies on discipline, on established hierarchies. Allowing such unrestrained force to exist undermines everything." Yan-Zhu's response was a single, devastating laugh. It wasn't a jovial sound, but a dry, rasping expulsion of air that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Hierarchy is built on control, Lord Zhao. The Earth does not respect control. It respects balance. And you, with your legions and your threats, have demonstrably disrupted that balance." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the room. It wasn't violent, but a subtle vibration, a low hum that resonated deep within the stone floor. The pit in the center of the hall began to shift. A ripple of dust rose from its polished granite walls, and the air thickened with an almost palpable energy. Master Lin, his eyes wide with horrified realization, frantically pointed at his scrolls. "The resonance! The patterns, they're amplifying. The Earth is responding to your observation, Sovereign. You're feeding the instability." Yan-Zhu remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on the pit. "You misunderstand, Master Lin. I do not feed instability. I am the instability. I am the point at which the Earth's natural order breaks and reforms." As the tremors intensified, the pit deepened, slowly expanding outwards. The polished granite began to crack, revealing veins of shimmering ore beneath the surface. Within moments, the pit was 30 feet deep, a perfect, swirling vortex of compressed earth and shimmering stone. Then, from the depths of the pit, a single enormous geode burst forth, shattering against the floor with a resounding crack. It wasn't just a geode, it was a miniature mountain, perfectly formed, its interior lined with gigantic amethyst crystals that pulsed with an internal light. The air filled with the scent of raw minerals, and something ancient, something profoundly powerful. As the last fragments of the miniature mountain settled, a voice, impossibly deep and resonant, echoed through the hall. It wasn't spoken, but felt a vibration that resonated directly within the minds of everyone present. "The mountain remembers," the voice boomed, "and the stone has spoken." The Emperor, pale and visibly shaken, rose to his feet. "Seize him," he commanded, his voice tight with a fear he rarely allowed himself to display. "Seize Yan-Zhu and bring him before me." But before any guards could move, Yan-Zhu calmly stepped towards the newly formed pit, bending down to examine a single, perfect amethyst crystal. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. "This," he said, his voice now imbued with a strange, quiet authority, "is not a weapon. It is a reflection, a reminder of the Earth's capacity for both devastation and creation. He looked up at the assembled court, his golden eyes blazing with an unsettling intensity. You sought to control the Earth, he continued, but the Earth controls you. The price of defiance is not merely a whipping post or a cartload of manure. It is the loss of your soul. Then, with a final, deliberate movement, he crushed the amethyst crystal into dust. The tremors ceased. The pit stabilized. The hall fell silent once more. This time a silence of utter, breathtaking terror. Chapter 6. The echo of the summit. The aftermath of the grand Imperial hunt hung thick in the air, not just with the scent of blood and trampled earth, but with a palpable sense of disorientation. Commander Deng, stripped of his dignity and reduced to a whimpering shadow of his former arrogance, dragged Yan-Zhu's manure cart with a grim determination, the punishment a slow, agonizing reminder of his folly. The Imperial guards, initially a chaotic swarm, now stood in tight formations around the newly established Yan-Zhu Academy, a building of polished obsidian and jade that seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight. The Emperor, surprisingly, remained sequestered within his chambers, issuing only terse orders relayed by nervous advisors. Yan-Zhu, meanwhile, moved with a deliberate grace that seemed utterly incongruous with his humble occupation. He oversaw the construction of the academy with an unnerving efficiency, issuing commands that were met with immediate, unquestioning obedience. The sheer scale of the operation, hundreds of young men and women being rigorously trained in swordsmanship, archery, and horseback riding, was a stark contrast to his previous existence. Yet, he remained untouched by the awe, the fear, or even the admiration of those he commanded. He treated them with a quiet, almost melancholic, respect, observing their struggles with a distant, knowing gaze. Xiao Hui, sheltered within her newly built estate, found herself the center of a simmering, bewildered curiosity. The fertile valleys, now known as the Huan domains, were unbelievably productive, yielding harvests that dwarfed those of neighboring provinces. The estate itself was a testament to Yan-Zhu's power, a haven of luxury built with materials seemingly conjured from the mountain itself, yet she refused to indulge in its comforts. She spent her days tending to the meticulously cultivated gardens, learning about the cultivation of herbs, and, most often, seeking out Yan-Zhu. Their meetings were always brief, always imbued with a sense of quiet contemplation. "The earth remembers," she said one afternoon, watching him meticulously examine a piece of slate. "It feels weighty." Yan-Zhu nodded slowly. "It remembers the pressure of a summit collapsing," he replied, his voice low. "And it remembers the consequences of disrupting that balance." He then pointed to a deep fissure running through the slate, a hairline fracture that seemed to pulse with a faint internal luminescence, mirroring the sync crystals. "The mountain doesn't forgive arrogance, little one." The arrival of a delegation from the Imperial Military Council, led by the grizzled General Zhao, marked a turning point. Zhao, a veteran of countless campaigns, was renowned for his strategic brilliance and his unwavering loyalty to the Emperor. He had witnessed Yan-Zhu's display in the hunt, and unlike the rest of the court, he had approached Yan-Zhu with a cautious respect, recognizing the undeniable force he wielded. "Sovereign Yan-Zhu," Zhao began, bowing deeply, "the Emperor wishes to formally express his gratitude for your intervention. The incident with the obsidian boars was concerning, to say the least. Your actions prevented a potentially catastrophic loss of life, and demonstrated a power unlike anything the Empire has ever seen." Yan-Zhu simply inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "Gratitude is a fragile currency, General. It is earned through action, not words." He paused, then added, "I understand the Emperor seeks to understand the source of my abilities. He desires a demonstration of this weight of mountains." Zhao, sensing an opportunity, proposed a controlled training session. He insisted on a series of rigorous tests, designed to assess Yan-Zhu's capabilities and, hopefully, determine the precise nature of his powers. The Emperor, eager to demonstrate his control and secure Yan-Zhu's allegiance, readily agreed. The demonstration took place in the sprawling courtyard of the academy, a meticulously prepared arena filled with obstacles designed to test physical and mental fortitude. Zhao orchestrated a series of challenges, timed runs, archery drills, combat simulations, each designed to push Yan-Zhu to his limits. But Yan-Zhu did not compete. Instead, he stood motionless in the center of the courtyard, his eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. A palpable shift occurred in the air, a subtle intensification of the tremors that had initially alerted the court to his power. The ground beneath his feet began to vibrate, and a shimmering distortion appeared in the air, like heat rising from stone. Then, with a voice that resonated not through the ears, but directly within the minds of everyone present, Yan-Zhu spoke the voice of the mountain itself. "Balance," it intoned, "is the foundation of all things. To disrupt it is to invite destruction." He opened his eyes, and the air solidified, the distortion vanished. A single perfect lotus flower bloomed at his feet, seemingly from nowhere, its petals shimmering with an iridescent light. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The assembled warriors, the Imperial guards, even General Zhao, recoiled in terror, a primal instinct urging them to flee. They understood, with a chilling clarity, that Yan-Zhu was not merely a warrior, he was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the mountain's wrath. And he was, undeniably, their master. Chapter 7. The echo of stone, the courtyard of the newly acquired Imperial Academy of Martial Arts, was silent, a silence thick with stunned disbelief and nascent fear. The lotus flower, still radiating an otherworldly glow, sat on the meticulously swept stone, a stark, beautiful accusation in the midst of the disciplined chaos. Even the usually unflappable General Zhao, a man who'd seen countless battles and the brutal realities of the Imperial army, shifted uncomfortably, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Yan-Zhu remained motionless, his expression a mask of serene contemplation. He hadn't moved since the voice of the mountain echoed through the minds of the assembled crowd. The tremors, previously a subtle undercurrent, intensified, not violently, but with a focused, rhythmic pulse that resonated deep within the bones. It was as if the very stone of the academy was responding to his presence. "The lotus represents resilience," Yan-Zhu finally said, his voice low and measured, carrying a weight that belied his humble appearance. "It blooms in the face of adversity, drawing strength from the mud. It is a reminder that true power is not exerted through brute force, but through understanding and control." He gestured to the flower with a hand that moved with a deceptive grace, the calloused skin momentarily hidden beneath a gesture of profound authority. The reaction was a slow, creeping tide of confusion. Some of the younger officers, eager to impress, attempted to mirror his posture, attempting to channel some of the apparent power radiating from him. Several immediately collapsed, overwhelmed by the strain, their faces contorted with pain and disorientation. Zhao, recovering his composure, stepped forward, his voice a carefully modulated blend of respect and apprehension. "Sovereign Yan-Zhu," he began, bowing deeply, "we are humbled by your display. The legends they spoke of the weight of mountains, but we dismiss them as mere tales. Your abilities they are beyond anything we could have imagined." Yan-Zhu accepted the bow with a slight inclination of his head. "Legends are born from truth, General Zhao. The mountains hold wisdom, and I am but a humble vessel through which it can be expressed." He paused, observing the officers, assessing their intentions. "My acquisition of this academy is not an act of dominion, but an investment. I intend to refine the minds and bodies of your students, to instill in them a respect for the delicate balance of the world." As he spoke, the tremors subsided slightly, the shimmering distortion in the air fading completely. The court began to tentatively resume its activity, the guards cautiously returning to their posts, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. The initial terror hadn't vanished entirely, but it was tempered with a burgeoning curiosity, a desperate desire to understand the nature of this extraordinary man. Suddenly, a young officer, barely a man, named Li Wei, boldly approached Yan-Zhu. Li Wei was known for his reckless enthusiasm and tendency to challenge authority. "Sovereign," he declared, his voice brimming with youthful arrogance, "with all due respect, your display was unnatural. A peasant manipulating stone with a single palm strike? It defies logic." Yan-Zhu's expression didn't change. He simply closed his eyes briefly, focusing. The ground beneath Li Wei's feet pulsed with a subtle vibration, and the air around the young officer thickened, becoming heavy and suffocating. Li Wei gasped, clutching at his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. He stumbled backward, collapsing in a heap. The courtyard fell silent again, this time with a palpable sense of dread. It wasn't a forceful command. It was something far more unsettling, a direct connection to the mountain's will, a momentary demonstration of its judgment. Yan-Zhu opened his eyes, his gaze settling on Li Wei. "Logic, young officer," he said, his voice now edged with a quiet sadness, "is a fragile thing. It is born of perception, and perception is often clouded by ignorance and arrogance. True strength lies not in defying the natural order, but in understanding it." He knelt beside Li Wei, examining the young officer's struggling form. "The earth remembers," he murmured, his hand gently pressing against Li Wei's chest. Slowly, the color returned to Li Wei's face. "It has a way of reminding us of our place." As Li Wei regained his senses, a low rumble echoed through the academy, emanating not from the ground, but seemingly from within Yan-Zhu himself. The lotus flower on the stone pulsed with an intensified light, and for a fleeting moment, everyone present witnessed a glimpse of something ancient and impossibly powerful, a shimmering, swirling vortex of energy, a reflection of the weight of mountains incarnate. It was a terrifying, humbling revelation, confirming that Yan-Zhu was not merely a warrior, but a conduit for a force that could reshape the very landscape of the world. The lesson, unspoken but undeniably understood, was clear: underestimate him at your peril. Chapter 8. The Echo of Stone. The air in the academy hung thick with unspoken awe. Li Wei, still pale and trembling, stared at Yan-Zhu with an expression of bewildered reverence. The ripple of energy, the brief, terrifying glimpse of the mountain core, had solidified something more than just a theory. It was a visceral understanding of the immense power residing within the unassuming peasant. The martial arts instructors, veterans hardened by decades of rigorous training, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Their years of doctrine, of meticulously crafted techniques, suddenly felt inadequate. The High Minister, Lord Zhao, a man who'd previously dismissed Yan-Zhu with a disdainful snort, now stood rigid, his face drained of color. Had been the loudest proponent of the human anchor experiment, a cruel demonstration intended to break Yan-Zhu's spirit. Now he seemed to recognize that He'd been playing with forces beyond his comprehension. Yan-Zhu, observing the reaction with a quiet intensity, slowly rose to his feet. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his humble appearance, the subtle flex of muscle hinting at the incredible power contained within. He walked to the center of the courtyard, his boots making no sound on the polished stone. "This," he said, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the academy, "is not a show of strength. It is a reminder that the world operates by rules far older and grander than the ambitions of men." He gestured vaguely towards the crumbling walls of the academy, to the meticulously groomed gardens, to the rigid order of the martial arts students training nearby. "You seek to master the earth, to control its forces. But the earth does not yield to control. It yields to understanding." He approached a large, uncarved boulder dominating one corner of the courtyard. It was a common training stone, used by students to hone their fundamental striking techniques. Yan-Zhu circled it slowly, his hand outstretched, not in aggression, but in a gesture of almost reverent curiosity. Then, with a single deliberate movement, he brought his palm down upon the stone. The sound was not a crash, but a sustained, deep tone, like a struck bell resonating through a vast cavern. The stone didn't shatter. Instead, a thin, shimmering wave pulsed outwards, briefly illuminating the faces of the onlookers. It wasn't the explosive force of the boar encounter. It was something far more nuanced. A gentle probing of the stone's density, its composition, its very essence. Suddenly, a young student, Master Chen, one of the most promising in the academy, shouted, "Stop! You are violating the fundamental principles of impact. You're disrupting its structural integrity." Yan-Zhu paused, his hand still hovering above the stone. He looked at Master Chen, his expression unreadable. "And what principles are those, Master Chen?" he asked, his voice laced with a subtle mockery. "The principle that a mountain is meant to be broken? That a warrior is meant to dominate?" He then resumed his examination, this time focusing on the subtle shifts in the air around the stone, the infinitesimal tremors that ran through the ground. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a low guttural sound escaped his lips, not a shout, but a resonant hum, as if he were translating the stone's silent language. After a moment, he opened his eyes, and a faint, ethereal blue glow emanated from his hands, clinging to the surface of the boulder. "The mountain doesn't resist," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It adapts. It simply flows. To truly understand its strength, one must not force, but yield. To understand its defense, one must not attack, but become one with the flow." As he spoke, the blue glow intensified, and the air around the stone seemed to thicken, becoming almost viscous. The students gasped, instinctively stepping back. It was then that the courtyard truly understood. This was not simply a peasant displaying unusual strength. This was something far, far greater. The mountain core wasn't just a martial art, it was a connection to an ancient elemental force that demanded respect, not fear. Xiao Hui, who had been silently observing from the edge of the courtyard, approached cautiously. "The earth remembers," she said, echoing the words she had spoken to Yan-Zhu weeks ago. "It has a way of reminding us of our place." Yan-Zhu turned to her, a flicker of something akin to gratitude in his eyes. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. "You understood this before anyone else," he said, his voice sincere. "You saw the mountain in a handful of dust, and you taught me to listen." The lotus flower on the stone pulsed with a final, brilliant flash of light, before fading back to its muted serenity. The air grew still, the only evidence of the extraordinary event, the lingering scent of ozone, and the stunned faces of the assembled warriors. Chapter 9. The Weight of a Dynasty. The immediate aftermath of the Imperial hunt was a whirlwind of frantic activity. High Minister Zhao, a man whose face perpetually wore the pinched expression of a man perpetually calculating, moved with a speed Yan-Zhu hadn't witnessed before. He dispatched envoys to the emperor, detailing the unbelievable display of power, emphasizing, of course, the unprecedented return of the Yan Prefecture's lineage. The emperor, a shrewd man known for his love of spectacle and his distrust of dissent, was predictably thrilled. A peasant who single-handedly subdued a monstrous boar and then promptly acquired the military academy was a story ripe for propaganda. Yan-Zhu, meanwhile, found himself the reluctant center of a court steeped in suspicion and veiled ambition. The officers who had once mocked him now regarded him with a mixture of awe and thinly disguised resentment. Deng, stripped of his rank and reduced to a miserable existence dragging manure, was a constant source of irritation, his attempts at taunts reduced to guttural curses muttered under his breath. Yan-Zhu simply ignored him, focusing on the monumental task of rebuilding the prefecture and establishing a foundation of justice. Xiao Hui's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The white marble estate, a testament to Yan-Zhu's swift and decisive action, rose quickly from the landscape, a beacon of prosperity and quiet power. The valleys she had been granted were transformed into carefully terraced fields, teeming with life, and producing an abundance of crops. The villagers, initially wary, quickly learned to respect the gentle strength of the new lord, recognizing the wisdom in his decisions and the undeniable benefits of his protection. However, the change within Yan-Zhu himself was perhaps the most unsettling. The brief, dazzling display of the mountain core had left a subtle but profound mark. The blue glow, once a fleeting shimmer, now seemed to linger just beneath his skin, a faint, pulsing energy that occasionally manifested as a heightened awareness, a feeling of being intimately connected to the earth beneath his feet. He began to instinctively anticipate movements, to react with an unnatural speed and precision skills that sharpened with each passing day. One evening, as he oversaw the completion of a new irrigation canal, he found himself instinctively correcting the angle of a shovel with a subtle shift of his weight. The movement was so fluid, so effortless, that even he was surprised by its power. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that the mountain core wasn't just a technique, it was becoming a part of him, an extension of his very being. That night, he sought out Xiaohui, finding her tending to a small herb garden beneath the towering pillars of her estate. "I've been experimenting," he confessed, hesitant to reveal the full extent of his transformation. "With the mountain core, I find myself anticipating things, feeling the flow of energy around me, almost as if I were a part of the earth itself." Xiaohui, accustomed to his quiet intensity, simply nodded. "The earth doesn't speak in words, Yan-Zhu," she said, her voice soft. "It speaks through feeling. You're learning to listen." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the ground. Not a violent quake, but a subtle vibration that resonated through their feet. Yan-Zhu instinctively drew on the mountain core, a surge of energy flowing through him, solidifying his form, making him denser than stone. He felt the earth responding to his will, the tension in the soil easing as he exerted his control. "Someone is trying to disrupt the flow," he murmured, his eyes narrowed. The scent of ozone, familiar from the Imperial hunt, filled the air, mingled with a faint, acrid odor, the unmistakable scent of iron and dark magic. Before he could react, a squadron of cavalry, led by a ruthless officer named Li Wei, burst into the courtyard. Li Wei was a known agent of the exiled Fang clan, a rival house that had long sought to reclaim the Yan Prefecture's territory. He carried a crimson-etched jade talisman, rumored to amplify martial energies. "The sovereign plays with the earth's patience," Li Wei shouted, his voice dripping with venom. "This is a provocation. We will demonstrate the strength of the Empire." He launched into a whirlwind of attacks, wielding a broadsword with brutal efficiency. Yan-Zhu moved with a speed that defied comprehension. He didn't meet Li Wei's attacks head-on. He flowed around them, using the mountain core to anticipate and deflect. He didn't strike to kill, but to disrupt, to neutralize. With a carefully placed palm strike, he shattered Li Wei's talisman, rendering his sword useless. With a final controlled application of the mountain core, he sent Li Wei sprawling into a meticulously constructed mud pit. As the dust settled, a chilling realization dawned on Yan-Zhu. This wasn't a random act of aggression. It was a deliberate attempt to provoke him, to test the limits of his power, to expose him to the full might of the Empire's forces. He was no longer just hiding as a peasant. He was a weapon, and someone was determined to wield him. Chapter 10. Echoes of Stone. The aftermath of the mud pit incident hung thick in the air, a mixture of stunned silence and simmering fury. The Imperial Guard, initially paralyzed by the impossible display of Yan-Zhu's power, now surged forward, their polished bronze armor reflecting the bruised twilight. Commander Li Wei, coated in clinging mud and nursing a throbbing shoulder, glared at Yan-Zhu with a venomous intensity. "You insolent whelp!" he roared. You think you can simply crush us with your unnatural strength? You'll learn that even a peasant's mud is a formidable defense. Yan-Zhu, standing calmly amidst the chaos, observed them with an unnerving stillness. Had spent the last few hours carefully cataloging the situation. Levi's actions weren't simply driven by the Fang clan's ambitions. There was a calculated precision to them, a disturbing eagerness to provoke a response. The Crimson Talisman had been a blatant provocation, and Levi's frantic attacks were a thinly veiled attempt to force Yan-Zhu into a more direct confrontation, a confrontation that would reveal just how much power he truly possessed. The High Minister, a portly man named Zhao, stepped forward, attempting to regain control. "Silence!" he bellowed, his voice strained. "This is a grave disturbance. We must apprehend this peasant and bring him before the Emperor." He gestured to several guards, who began to cautiously advance on Yan-Zhu. But Yan-Zhu didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge their approach. Instead, he focused his attention on Xiaohui, who had cautiously approached the periphery of the disturbance, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She had witnessed the entire spectacle, and her quiet observations seemed to hold a strange significance. "Little Weaver," Yan-Zhu said, his voice low and carrying an unexpected authority, "you see something here that others do not." Xiaohui, emboldened by his gentle tone and the realization that he posed no immediate threat, stepped forward. I see a storm, Master," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the disrupted ground where Levi lay. A storm of stone and shadow. Just then, a ripple of movement caught Yan-Zhu's eye. Hidden amongst the shadows of the palace walls, a group of men clad in the gray uniforms of the Imperial Assassin Corps began to emerge. Their movements were fluid, silent, utterly professional. Their leader, a lean, scarred man named Lu, bowed deeply to the High Minister. "Minister Zhao," Lu announced, his voice a low murmur. "We have observed this individual. He possesses a power that defies explanation, a power that could destabilize the entire empire. We recommend immediate containment and interrogation." The High Minister's face tightened. He clearly recognized the danger. The Assassin Corps were renowned for their ruthlessness, and their intervention signaled a decisive shift in the balance of power. This wasn't a simple matter of a peasant rebelling against a bully. This was a calculated maneuver, orchestrated by forces far more powerful than a single Commander Deng. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the courtyard. Not a violent earthquake, but a subtle vibration, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. Yan-Zhu felt it instinctively, a primal awareness that escalated his senses. The mountain core pulsed with power, responding to the change in the atmosphere. He knew, with chilling certainty, that he wasn't just being hunted, he was being tested. The tremor wasn't natural. It was a focused exertion of energy, a deliberate attempt to gauge the extent of his power, to find a vulnerability. Without warning, a figure materialized from the shadows behind Lu, a slender man dressed in the dark robes of the Assassin Corps. He moved with a speed that was almost unsettling, appearing as abruptly as a sudden gust of wind. He launched himself at Yan-Zhu with a poisoned dagger, aiming for the throat. Yan-Zhu reacted without conscious thought. He shifted his density, becoming an immovable pillar of rock and shadow. The dagger, launched with lethal precision, struck the newly formed density, shattering against it with a sound like cracking ice. The assassin, thrown off balance, stumbled backward, his face contorted in surprise. Before he could recover, Yan-Zhu unleashed a controlled burst of energy. Not a destructive strike, but a focused wave of compressed air, amplified by the mountain core. The wave slammed into the assassin, knocking him off his feet and forcing him against a stone pillar. As the assassin lay stunned, a single chilling voice echoed through the courtyard. "The mountain remembers," it said, the words seemingly resonating from the very stones themselves. Yan-Zhu turned his gaze to Xiaohui, who was staring at him with an expression of profound understanding. "You have seen the shadow of the mountain," he said, his voice gaining strength. It will guide us. He knew, with growing dread, that he was no longer merely a peasant hiding his power. He was a key, a catalyst, and the forces arrayed against him were not simply seeking to defeat him, but to break him, to unravel the secrets of the weight of mountains and unleash its destructive potential upon the Empire. The reckoning had begun, and it was far more complex and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 11. Echoes in the stone. The aftermath of the assassination attempt hung heavy in the air of the Imperial Academy, thick with the scent of sandalwood incense and a palpable unease. Yan-Zhu, now formally recognized as the heir of Yan Prefecture, oversaw the meticulous examination of the courtyard, not with the steel of a warrior, but with a quiet, unsettling intensity. The assassins, 3 men from the Crimson Fang, a notoriously brutal assassins guild known for its infiltration of the Imperial Guard, were bound and gagged, awaiting interrogation. Their leader, a wiry man named Zhao, lay unconscious, a trickle of blood staining the flagstones beside him. Xiao Hui remained by his side, her presence a surprisingly calming influence amidst the chaos. She had observed the entire sequence, the devastating precision of Yan-Zhu's defense, the chilling resonance of his voice. She hadn't asked questions, simply watched, absorbing the weight of his power with a disconcerting clarity. "The Crimson Fang," Yan-Zhu said, his voice low, addressed to High Minister Li, a man whose carefully crafted fade of respect was crumbling under the weight of the events. "They weren't merely attempting to kill me. They were probing, testing the limits of my ability. And they succeeded in triggering something far more profound than they anticipated." Li shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the guards surrounding the courtyard. "The Emperor's deeply concerned, Heir. Such blatant aggression must be met with swift and decisive action. We will deploy every resource to identify the forces behind this attack." Yan-Zhu offered a small, sardonic smile. "Decisive action? You misunderstand, Minister. This was not a military conflict. This was an echo of the mountain itself. Zhao and his men focused their attack on a single point, my defense, but they inadvertently activated a dormant state within me, a resonance with the very essence of the weight of mountains." He turned his gaze towards a newly constructed observation platform overlooking the Academy's training grounds. Head ordered a series of subtle tests to be conducted, sparring matches with seasoned warriors, simulated combat scenarios, all designed to gauge the full extent of his power, and, more importantly, the triggers that seemed to unlock its potential. "I've noticed a pattern," Yan-Zhu continued, his voice growing tighter. "The intensity of the resonance, the power I can access, fluctuates with emotion. Specifically, with a sense of injustice, of profound and unwavering resolve. It's not about anger, not entirely. It's about a deeply rooted understanding of balance, of the natural order." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the courtyard. It wasn't an earthquake, not precisely. It was a subtle vibration, a resonance felt in the bones, a feeling of immense contained pressure. The stones beneath their feet shifted slightly. Everyone froze. Xiao Hui was the first to react, her eyes widening in recognition. "The mountain, it remembers," she whispered, echoing the chilling phrase Yan-Zhu had uttered in the courtyard after the assassination. As if in response to her words, a single, flawlessly polished obsidian shard detached itself from the stone wall of the Academy's library, spiraling downwards and landing silently at Yan-Zhu's feet. It pulsed with a faint inner light, a miniature reflection of the dark, impenetrable depths of the forest from which the obsidian boars originated. "This was not a random occurrence," Yan-Zhu said, picking up the shard. "The Crimson Fang did not simply attempt to kill me. They instigated a response. A deliberate, orchestrated act of provocation." He examined the shard with a scrutinizing gaze. "And it seems they've unwittingly revealed a vulnerability, a connection between the weight of mountains and the natural world." He turned to High Minister Li, his expression grim. I believe we are facing something far more ancient and far more dangerous than a mere assassination plot. The Emperor's ancestors utilized the weight of mountains for generations to maintain order, to protect the Empire. But that knowledge was lost, deliberately suppressed, when the lineage was stripped of its true heritage. This rediscovery is destabilizing everything. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows of the training grounds. Several warriors instinctively drew their swords, their faces etched with fear. From the depths of the Academy's armory, a squad of elite guards, led by a stoic veteran named General Zhao, emerged, each carrying a specially crafted, rune-etched warhammer relics of a forgotten dynasty, rumored to be attuned to geomantic energies. "Heir," General Zhao announced, his voice radiating an unsettling calmness. "We have detected a significant shift in the Earth's energy. The mountain is awakening. We must reinforce the Academy's defenses and prepare for potential incursions. It appears the Crimson Fang's actions have attracted attention, and not just from our enemies." Yan-Zhu looked at Xiao Hui, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He knew, with growing certainty, that the reckoning hadn't just begun with the assassination of a peasant. It was a turning of a key, a stirring of forces that had slumbered for centuries. He was no longer merely protecting his own inheritance, he was guarding the fragile balance of the Empire, and perhaps the very soul of the mountain itself. And he suspected, with a chilling premonition, that the fight to come would not be measured in battles won or lost, but in the whispers echoing in the stone. Chapter 12. Echoes in the stone. The rain had stopped, leaving a slick sheen on the courtyard of the Imperial Academy, reflecting the oppressive gray of the late afternoon sky. Yan-Zhu, dressed now in simple, dark linen robes, stood observing General Zhao and his squad as they meticulously adjusted the placement of the rune-etched warhammers. The air thrummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, and the veteran guards moved with an unnerving precision, as if conducting a silent orchestra. Xiao Hui, surprisingly, was present, assisting Zhao with a small pouch of polished jade stones. She had been summoned by the High Minister, a surprisingly shrewd man named Lu, who seemed more interested in Yan-Zhu's capabilities than in offering congratulations. Lu, a former strategist himself, had been the first to recognize the gravity of the situation. "The boy has potential, a raw force that shouldn't be allowed to dissipate," Head stated, his gaze sharp and unsettling. "We need to understand what he is before it consumes us all." Yan-Zhu didn't respond to Lu's observation. He focused on the guards, their movements a testament to a discipline honed over decades. The war hammers, carved from a meteorite-like stone and etched with symbols of ancient mountain spirits, pulsed faintly with the same unsettling energy he felt in the air. It was a tangible manifestation of the weight of mountains, a power he was only beginning to grasp, a power deliberately locked away by his ancestors. "Heir," Zhao said, his voice cutting through the quiet intensity. "The geomantic readings are escalating. The Earth's resistance is heightened. It's as if the mountain itself is rejecting our attempts to contain it." He paused, his eyes, the color of polished jade, fixed on Yan-Zhu. "We believe the Crimson Fang has triggered a resonance, disrupting the flow of energies that have protected this place for centuries. Their destabilizing of the obsidian boar nest was more than a mere display of power, it was a deliberate act of provocation. The Crimson Fang." The name hung in the air, laden with menace. It was the clandestine organization responsible for the assassination of his grandfather, the last legitimate heir of the Yan Prefecture, and the one responsible for erasing his family's true heritage. They sought to destabilize the empire, feeding on chaos and discontent. Yan-Zhu realized with a chilling clarity that his accident with the boar hadn't been a random occurrence. It was a calculated move, a beacon designed to draw him out. Suddenly, a tremor shook the courtyard, stronger than before. The rune-etched warhammers flared with a brilliant crimson light, and a collective gasp rippled through the guards. As the light subsided, a swirling vortex of dust and gravel erupted from the center of the training grounds, revealing a partially collapsed section of the Academy's ancient foundation. From the swirling dust emerged a figure tall, clad in midnight blue silk, his face obscured by a cowl embroidered with a stylized phoenix. He moved with an unsettling fluidity, almost as if he were gliding rather than walking. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't an Imperial guard. He was a predator. Interesting. The figure's voice was a low, melodic rasp, laced with an ancient wisdom and a chilling amusement. The mountain has finally stirred. He raised a hand, and several of the warhammers spontaneously launched themselves, not towards the vortex, but towards Yan-Zhu. Without a word, Yan-Zhu moved. It wasn't a dramatic martial arts display. There was no flourishing of fists, no elaborate stances. It was a subtle shift in his own density, a compression of his body into an impenetrable shield. The warhammers slammed against his form, the impact resonating with a sickening thud, but they simply bounced off, leaving no mark. The figure, seemingly unfazed, smirked. Impressive, Heir. But even the weight of a mountain cannot hold back the tide. He extended a hand, and a shimmering blue energy coalesced around his palm, a miniature storm, crackling with raw power. Yan-Zhu knew, instinctively, that this wasn't just a warrior. This was a keeper, a member of the ancient order, tasked with maintaining the balance between the mortal realm and the spirit world. He recognized the signature of the Azure Storm, a technique rumored to be capable of tearing apart mountains and summoning cyclones. "You misunderstand, Keeper," Yan-Zhu said, his voice calm, yet laced with a barely perceptible edge of steel. "I am not trying to hold back the tide. I am trying to shape it." He took a step forward, and the ground beneath his feet shifted, subtly altering its density. The air around him thickened, and the ground began to subtly crack, mirroring the tremors in the courtyard. The mountain within him was awakening, and he was beginning to understand its terrible, beautiful power. The reckoning had truly begun. Chapter 13. Echoes of the Storm. The days following the grand Imperial hunt were a whirlwind of hushed whispers and frantic speculation. Commander Deng's 7 years of manure cart servitude were a spectacle witnessed by the entire capital, and the rapid acquisition of the military academy by Yan-Zhu sent tremors through the established hierarchies. But it was Yan-Zhu's displayed power, the raw, terrifying manifestation of the weight of mountains, that truly gripped the court. High Minister Zhao, a man whose ambition had long been tempered by a cautious respect for Yan-Zhu's lineage, now moved with a hesitant deference, offering lavish gifts and seeking counsel on matters of state. Yan-Zhu, meanwhile, continued his outwardly unremarkable life, hauling manure and stone, occasionally offered a respectful bow by passing merchants. He did this not out of shame, but out of a deliberate calm, a strategic observation of the ripples his actions were creating. He knew the imperial court was a viper's nest of intrigue, and revealing too much too soon would be a fatal error. Zhao Hui's estate was a breathtaking testament to his generosity, a white marble edifice nestled amongst the most fertile valleys, overlooking the shimmering Jade River. She had insisted on naming it Echo, a nod to the feeling of being sheltered and protected, like a mountain's reverberations. The estate was staffed by dozens of servants, brought from across the empire, and she quickly established herself as a respected figure, dispensing wisdom and occasionally, much to the consternation of the older courtiers, offering practical advice on matters of irrigation and crop rotation. However, the tranquility was shattered by a series of unsettling events. Strange tremors began to ripple through the land surrounding Yan-Zhu's estate, unsettling the livestock and causing minor landslides. The Imperial Observatory, a sprawling complex dedicated to astronomical observation, reported erratic readings, indicating unusual fluctuations in the magnetic field. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of a disturbed spirit, a fractured connection between realms, and the return of a forgotten power. It was during one of these tremors, a particularly violent one, that cracked the foundations of the western wing of Echo, that the keeper, Master Lin, finally revealed himself. He appeared silently, as he had at the hunt, coalescing from the shimmering heat haze above the estate's meticulously cultivated rice paddies. This time, however, he didn't simply observe. He moved with a purpose, a subtle, unnerving grace that felt entirely out of place amidst the panicked servants scrambling for safety. "The disturbance is escalating, Sovereign," Lin said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The mountain's core is not merely awakening, it is bleeding." Yan-Zhu, who had been calmly directing the servants to reinforce the crumbling structure, turned, his expression unreadable. "Bleeding? Explain." Lin gestured towards the cracked foundations, a swirling vortex of energy already forming around his hands. "The act at the Imperial hunt, while a necessary demonstration of your power, has acted as a catalyst. You tapped into the mountain's heart, drawing upon a reservoir of energy that was previously sealed. Now, that energy is seeking an outlet, and it's manifesting as instability, as fractured realities. The tremors are not merely geological, they are echoes of a disrupted connection." Suddenly the air thickened, and the courtyard shimmered. The sky, previously a brilliant azure, fractured into a kaleidoscope of colors. A low, guttural rumble echoed through the mountains, growing steadily louder. Xiao Hui, who had been assisting with the repairs, gasped, clutching her chest. "The mountain, it feels angry." Before Yan-Zhu could respond, Master Lin unleashed the azure storm. It wasn't a devastating display of raw power, not this time. Instead, it was a contained, focused torrent, directed not outwards, but downwards, aimed at the cracked foundations of Echo. The air crackled with blue energy, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate violently. "I am attempting to stabilize the flow," Lin explained, his face strained, "to knit back the fractured connection. But the resistance, it's significant. The mountain's core is fighting against the manipulation." As Lin worked, Yan-Zhu felt a profound shift within himself. The compression, the density, the feeling of being a living mountain had intensified, becoming almost unbearable. He realized Lin was correct. The mountain wasn't simply reacting to the disturbance. It was actively resisting, clinging to the fractured reality, fueled by an ancient, primal rage. Then, a voice, not spoken but felt, echoed within his mind, the voice of the mountain itself. "Release me!" The ground buckled violently. The azure energy flared, threatening to engulf them both. Yan-Zhu knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was no longer merely shaping the tide. He was caught in its current, and the current was turning against him. He braced himself, drawing upon every ounce of his training, every fiber of his being, and prepared to meet the reckoning. Chapter 14. The Echo of Fury. The air in the cavern of Echo hung thick with ozone, and a palpable sense of dread. Master Lin, his face slick with sweat, continued to channel the azure storm, his hands a blur of motion as he attempted to coax the fractured essence of the mountain back into alignment. The walls of the cavern pulsed with a sickly, bruised blue light, reflecting in the wide, terrified eyes of Xiao Hui, who stood frozen a few feet away, clutching a handful of damp earth. "The resistance is phenomenal," Lin gasped, his voice strained. "It's not just geological, Yan-Zhu. There's something else fighting alongside the stone. A deep, ancient resentment." Yan-Zhu remained motionless, his body a carefully constructed fortress of compressed density. He could feel the mountain's struggle, a grinding, agonizing pressure within his core, a primal scream of defiance that resonated with a terrifying familiarity. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades, the raw, untamed power of the weight of mountains, almost overwhelming him. The initial, controlled application of the art was a meditative process, a delicate shaping of his very being. Now, it felt like a battle for dominion. "It's angry," Xiao Hui whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the azure storm. "The mountain, it feels angry." Yan-Zhu turned his head slowly, his gaze fixed on her. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of the earth. It was a reminder of why Head chosen this life of anonymity, of the simple, honest people Head sworn to protect. Suddenly, the azure storm shifted. It didn't erupt in a blinding blast of energy, as Lin had anticipated. Instead, the blue light coalesced, forming a swirling vortex that spiraled downwards, directly towards the cavern floor. The tremors intensified, and the ground beneath them shifted violently. "Lin, stop!" Yan-Zhu shouted, his voice low and resonant. "You're exacerbating it. The pressure is building exponentially." Lin, lost in his concentration, ignored him. He continued to direct the flow of the azure storm, desperately trying to reinforce the crumbling connection. "I need to stabilize the core. If I lose control, the entire prefecture could be destabilized." But it was too late. As the vortex of blue energy touched the ground, the cavern erupted in a cacophony of sound and fury. The walls groaned and shifted, chunks of stone cascading down like frozen waterfalls. Then, a voice, undeniably the voice of the mountain itself, echoed within Yan-Zhu's mind, raw and filled with centuries of suppressed rage. "Release me!" The sensation was physical, a physical wrenching within his bones, a tightening around his heart. He felt the very tectonic plates beneath his feet shudder, responding to the mountain's desperate plea. The azure storm, now utterly out of control, surged outwards, engulfing the cavern in a blinding wave of blue energy. Yan-Zhu instinctively activated the weight of mountains, not to attack, but to contain. He forced his body to increase in density, becoming almost impossibly solid, a miniature mountain itself attempting to absorb the chaotic energy. He felt his muscles burn, his bones strain, pushing his limits to the absolute breaking point. But the mountain's anger was not easily contained. It manifested not as destructive force, but as a shift. The ground beneath his feet began to unravel, not with a violent tremor, but with a subtle, insidious unraveling of reality. The walls of the cavern shimmered and distorted, the familiar shapes of the stone twisting into grotesque, impossible configurations. He realized with horrifying clarity that Lin's attempt to repair the connection hadn't strengthened the mountain, it had awakened something far more ancient and dangerous, a deep-seated resentment born of millennia of slumber, a rejection of the very concept of manipulation. A single obsidian shard, ejected from the chaotic energy, struck Yan-Zhu in the shoulder, piercing his sleeve and drawing a thin line of crimson across his skin. He didn't flinch. Instead, he focused his will, channeling the mountain's fury through himself, attempting to anchor the crumbling reality. "The flow isn't meant to be controlled," he said, his voice strained but firm. "It's meant to be understood." He shifted his stance, drawing upon the fundamental principles of the weight of mountains, not of forceful imposition, but of empathetic resonance. He wasn't trying to force the mountain to obey, he was trying to listen. As he did, the swirling vortex of blue energy began to slow, the distortions in the cavern walls lessening. The mountain's voice within his mind softened, becoming less a scream of rage and more a weary lament. "For so long, I have slumbered, a silent witness to the shifting of the world. I have felt the encroachments of your people, the digging of your tunnels, the fracturing of my veins. And I have held back, knowing that even the smallest disturbance could unleash unimaginable chaos." Then, a new voice joined the chorus. A voice that wasn't the mountain's, but one he recognized with chilling certainty: Commander Deng, shouting from the entrance to the cavern, his face a mask of terror and bewildered awe. "By the Emperor's grace! What sorcery is this? He controls the mountains." The truth, stark and terrifying, dawned upon Yan-Zhu. The tests Deng had inflicted upon him were not acts of cruelty, but carefully calibrated attempts to provoke a reaction, to trigger the dormant power within him. He hadn't been a peasant, merely a pawn in a game he hadn't understood. A tool waiting to be deployed. And now, his revelation had been orchestrated, his power unleashed, not by accident, but by design. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 15. The stone speaks. The marble of Xiaohui's estate shimmered under the late afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the mud and sweat of Yan-Zhu's former existence. It wasn't ostentatious, leaning more towards serene functionality than gilded excess, but the white stone pulsed with a quiet strength, mirroring the mountain's essence had learned to command. Xiaohui, dressed in silks borrowed from the estate's seamstress, though she still wore her familiar's simple tunic, stood beside him, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. She was surrounded by her family, a collection of farmers and laborers, their faces alight with a bewildered joy. "It is magnificent," her father, Master Li, stammered, running a calloused hand over the cool surface of a fountain carved with depictions of swirling clouds and ancient peaks. "More than we ever dared to dream." Yan-Zhu offered a small, almost uncomfortable smile. "The mountain simply wished to express its gratitude. It has witnessed your kindness, your loyalty." He paused, acutely aware of the eyes of the Imperial Guard, now stationed discreetly at the estate's perimeter, observing this unprecedented display of power. The acquisition of the military academy had been swift and brutal, a carefully orchestrated demonstration of Yan-Zhu's resolve. Minister Zhao, his uncle, a man consumed by ambition and suspicion, had initially resisted, clinging to the belief that Yan-Zhu was a fool, a provincial wastrel. The revelation in the cavern, the shattering display of his power, had silenced him. Now, the academy, formerly a training ground for the emperor's elite, belonged to him, a statement of intent woven into the very fabric of the empire. Yet, the peace felt fragile. Deng's punishment, while satisfying, wasn't a complete solution. He remained a symbol of the arrogant disregard that had fueled Yan-Zhu's journey, a living reminder of the deception had endured. More unsettling was the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a current of unease that seemed to emanate not just from the imperial court, but from the mountain itself. He spent the evening in the estate's courtyard, observing the new inhabitants, learning their names, their skills, their hopes. Xiaohui, meanwhile, helped Master Li and his family settle in, explaining the intricate irrigation systems and the best ways to cultivate the land. As dusk deepened, Yan-Zhu found himself returning to the central pavilion, a structure built directly into the mountain's face, where had initially connected with the weight of mountains. He sat in the traditional lotus position, closing his eyes, attempting to recapture the connection, to listen once more to the mountain's voice. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the weary lament of a slumbering giant. It was agitated, fractured, layered with something dark. "He stirs again," a new voice whispered. Not from within the mountain, but from the shadows clinging to the pavilion walls. It was a voice of sharp angles and cold calculation, laced with an ancient malice. "The boy is awakening. He is too eager, too pure. It will be a dangerous thing." Yan-Zhu's eyes snapped open. He scanned the pavilion, his hand instinctively reaching for the smooth, polished stone he always carried, a fragment of the mountain itself. "Who speaks?" he demanded, his voice a low rumble. The voice chuckled, a dry rustling sound. "I am the echo of a forgotten god, trapped within the stone. I was the one who guided the weight, who shaped the land, before the mortals dared to claim dominion. I was corrupted." A vision flooded his mind, a tableau of unimaginable destruction, a world reshaped by raw, untamed power, a civilization crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. He saw himself, younger, stronger, consumed by the same hunger for control. "You are not the first to seek the weight of mountains," the voice continued, now growing stronger, more insistent. Many have attempted to harness its power, but few understand its true nature. It is not a weapon to be wielded, but a reflection of the world's balance. To force it, to dominate it, is to invite chaos. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Commander Deng. He hadn't been released from his sentence. Instead, had been summoned. His eyes were wide with terror, but a flicker of something else, recognition, perhaps, danced within them. You know? He whispered, his voice hoarse. I know more than you can possibly comprehend, the ancient voice hissed. And I know that the boy the Heir is about to make a terrible mistake. Before Yan-Zhu could react, Deng lunged, a crude, desperate attack fueled by years of resentment and a primal fear. Yan-Zhu instinctively raised his hand, not in aggression but in defense, and the blue energy returned, swirling around him with a terrifying intensity, fueled not by empathy this time, but by something far colder, far more potent. The mountain wasn't merely a protector, it was a weapon, and the corrupt god within it was ready to unleash its fury.